The other chairperson for the session will be Dr. Jamuna Rani Madam. She is Professor and HOD from Department of Pharmacology, SRM Medical College Hospital and Research Center. Madam has completed her MBBS, MD Pharmacology and PG Diploma in Health Sciences. Madam has over 30 years of teaching and research experience, and Madam has more than 40 publications in index journals. I invite Madam for introducing Dr. Amit.
Good afternoon, everybody. I feel very happy to introduce Dr. Amit for this national workshop on biosimilars development. He is a founder and CEO of Marksman Healthcare Communication. Dr. Amit did his MBBS and MD Pharmacology. He is a gold medalist from Goa Medical College and was the recipient of Babasaheb Ambedkar Award for being the university topper. He started off his career as an entrepreneur and has been working in the pharmaceutical space for over a decade now. He is the founder and CEO of Marksman Healthcare Communication, a data science company providing health, economics and outcomes research, real-world evidence, medical affairs, and data analytical services. He is also a founder and CEO of Dexium Technologies, which has launched 2 mobile applications, that is KYT Hardware and an artificial intelligence-based prescription digital therapeutics platform to improve patient adherence and health outcomes, and OncoWits, an oncology engagement platform. He is the course director of Marksman Academy of Health Sciences, which has launched an online certification program in fundamentals of economics and outcomes research. He is having an Indian Medical Affairs Summit, a first of its kind initiative that has been undertaken in India for the cause of medical affairs personnel to interact, learn, share new ideas, best practices, and case studies amongst involving communities.
Ma'am, are you there? Dr. Indu, can you hear, madam?
No, sir. I think there is some network.
Probably understand that we are looking at this topic of real-world evidence for biosimilars. So we all know how real-world evidence is today the buzzword. In most areas, you are trying to see how real-world evidence can actually add to understanding about a drug's efficacy and a drug's safety, particularly safety. And even though now we do have certain guidelines, but there's not much on the regulatory aspect as such as to how things change with respect to the regulatory understanding as far as real world evidence. Nevertheless, even in biosimilars, we see how in recent times there have been a lot of discussions on how real world evidence could add value in understanding biosimilars. So thank you, Dr. Dang, for being part of this workshop, and over to you for sharing your insights on this.
Sorry for the interruption. There was some technical problem.
No issue, no issue.
I feel very happy, and the last year's over 50 publications to his credit in national and international journals. I'm very happy to invite Dr. Amit to talk on real world evidence studies for biosimilars. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks, Melvin. I hope you all can hear me.
Yes, thanks. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. And thanks to SRM Medical College for inviting me on this wonderful session. It's been quite an exciting one. since morning, and I just wanted to confirm. Can you see my this thing, the screen?
Not yet. We aren't
Ju-
able to see.
Just a second. Can you see
Yeah.
now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay,
Please go
great. Great. Thank you so much once again. The topic of my talk today is real world evidence studies, and I'll be taking it through from the generic to the biosimilars, because the concept is quite nascent. It's quite in an infancy stage, I would say, especially in an Indian setting. So while I'm taking through the concept, so I'll take it through first regarding the concepts of real world evidence, and then going towards the biosimilars in particular. Now, when we talk about the importance of real world evidence, the background is, we all know that randomized controlled trials certainly is the gold standard for evidence, whether it comes to the efficacy and proving the safety of a particular drug. But needless to mention that there are still certain pitfalls when it comes to these RCTs. First and foremost, these are very ideal scenarios and settings. The patients from extremes of age, they are never a part of an RCT. Pregnant women, they are excluded from being a part of RCTs, and same happens with the patients with comorbidities, or the patients who are taking concomitant medications. They are generally excluded. Not always, but generally these set of patients are excluded when the RCT is going on. The question is, the results from RCTs, do they always happen in the ideal world, or in the real world? And that is where the real world evidence comes into picture. Now, if we go by the definition of real world data, so the US FDA describes it as ad verbatim, is the data collected from sources outside of the traditional clinical trials. Now, which can range from large simple trials to pragmatic clinical trials. It could be prospective observational studies, the registry findings, or the retrospective database studies, to even individually reported case reports, administrative or healthcare claims, EHRs, and the data obtained as part of the public health investigation or routine public health surveillance and registries. So one thing is very clear, the real world data is something where all the sources are outside of the traditional clinical trial setting. Now, that is something, we call it as RWD, or real world data. Now, what is RWE, or real world evidence? So it's sort of an organized information derived from the same real world data. Certainly, it's a non-experimental or a non-controlled setting, and the data can be used to either generate insights or foresights, and extrapolate findings on, be it a disease or a product or the patient population per se. And indeed, RWD, or the real world data, as described in the previous slide, it can either be collected prospectively or retrospectively. Now, these are some of the sources of real world evidence. It could be the pharma data, it could be an observational data, it could be hospital data, EHRs, EMRs, claims data, disease registries, product registries, or even pharmacy data for that matter. Even a lot of buzz is around the social media data as well. That also again is a part of a real world data. There is a very interesting concept of patients like me in US, and there are the heavy engagement of patients where they are sharing their experiences on an app, and a lot of insights are getting generated. So that's all becomes a part of real world data. Now, as we as I mentioned in the previous slide, that yes, there is a certain difference between the RCT and the real world data. So I'll just take you guys through the major differences. When it comes to the RCT data, the purpose is usually to talk about and proving the efficacy, but in real world data, it's more on the effectiveness side of it. Similarly, in RCT, it's more investigator centric, but real world data, I shouldn't say that is only patient centric, because even the RCT is something that goes that's like eventually it's the patient centric, but still, they always say that real world data is more patient centric. RCT is experimental on one hand, while the RWD, as the name implies, real world. Needless to mention, when it comes to the inclusion criteria, RCT data, it has very strict criteria, and RWD, nothing of that sort. And same applies to the comorbid illnesses or the concomitant medications. Now, when it comes to the attending physician, it is usually a designated representative whom we mostly call it as a principal investigator when it comes to the randomized control trial. In real world data, it could be any doctor, practitioner, the patient has chosen for himself or herself. RCT data, majority of the times, it's the placebo or the standard practice as per the study protocol that has been defined. But when it comes to RWD, it is as per the patient profile or the physician's discretion. Patient monitoring in RCT is quite continuous, but in RWD, it's like as the name applies. I mean, there is no fixed rule, it's changeable. Treatment, certainly as per the inclusion criteria, as per the treatment protocol, the treatment is fixed. In RWD is highly variable or depends on the physician's discretion. Follow-up, it's designed as per the protocol, and when it comes to real world data, it's again not as planned as RCT. So now, while we compare these two study designs, real world.
Sir, status like transaction
Dr. Indumati, please mute yourself.
WhatsApp.
Okay.
WhatsApp.
Dr. Indumati.
So while we compare real world evidence and RCT, so which one is better? This is a very common question that everyone has in mind once they start reading about RWE and RCT. So, the thing is, higher reverence is, of course, will be given to RCT because that is where, the drug gets the regulatory approval. But, when it comes to RWE, it's absolutely and equally informative. Reliability, sort of it, it's expected more from the RCT. But when it comes to the actual clinical aspect of a particular drug, that's where the real world evidence comes into picture. So in a nutshell, we can clearly say that they are mutually complementary and we cannot ignore either of these two studies. Now, there are some direct advantages of real world evidence data. First of all, it's quicker to access. It's overall less costlier as compared to the complete RCT, which is most of the time multi-centric and this. Secondly, when it comes to the real world evidence data, one can get rapid access. The data retrieval part is something, which is more easy as compared to, prospectively collecting the data in RCT in a controlled setting. It reflects the actual practice scenario rather than the experimental setting. And as we discussed, there's always the data which will talk about high risk groups or the pregnant women, the extremes of age, which were definitely not or majorly not were the part of RCTs. Secondly, real world evidence, it helps in the detection of less frequent side effects, as we saw in the previous presentation. And since there's a lot of data out there, the sample size is large, the follow-ups are more, and that gives a leverage of generalizing the findings as how exactly the drug is performing in real world. Now, if we actually relate real world evidence with pharmacovigilance, certainly, as we discussed in the previous presentation, there is a high likely chances of missing rare ADRs, especially in RCTs. The ADRs which are, the shorter duration of the follow-ups. I mean, that is something, which is a part or which is usually a feature of a randomized control trial. So the ADRs which were supposed to happen, delayed ADRs, that is something which, it would be too difficult to detect. And certainly, high risk group patients, there is a chance of missing ADRs in that particular population. So, it might be a buzzword, real world evidence, but, it's a common understanding that majority of the pharmacovigilance data collection is actually from real world evidence. Now, these are some of the, I would say, examples from the very recent history where the real world evidence sources helped, to detect the rare adverse drug reactions, and there was an actual change, or there was an actual outcome seen, like for example talking about rosiglitazone or pioglitazone. So there was this adverse drug reaction of bladder cancer, and all these ideas were detected when the insurance database was analyzed, which is one of the very important sources of real world evidence. So coming to this pioglitazone, it actually led to the US FDA label revision. Similarly, biphosphonates, the osteonecrosis of the jaw is something which started getting reported. One of the examples where the EMA had to withdraw the drug was ketoconazole because of the hepatotoxicity. Again, DPP4 inhibitors for type 2 diabetes mellitus, one of the very rare areas of acute pancreatitis, and the drug was put, on a high alert. So here, the key message what I am trying to mention, or what I'm trying to say, that, when there was so much of reporting of these adverse drug reactions, which was detected, from a real world source like an insurance database, these reactions started getting adverse drug reactions started getting noticed, and it actually led to a change of a label or a withdrawal of a drug, which is certainly something which cannot be absolutely ignored. Now, it's not just that real world evidence plays an important role only in the pharmacovigilance, but it also has a very potential role in the drug approval cycle as well. For example, now real world evidence, it can actually support the approval of supplementary indications. It can update safety information, as we discussed in the previous couple of slides. And certainly, when even when it comes to these supplementary indications, it could be an extension to the special populations which are usually not covered in the pivotal RCTs. Now, talking about the drug approvals, real world evidence can actually provide clinically relevant information, and since they can actually reduce a lot of time and cost and the patient burden associated with RCTs, that is something which is one of the key important aspects of RWE. These days, a lot of discussion is around the digital twin, the patient's digital twin, because every time the patient is going to a hospital, or booking a lab test, somewhere or the other the data is getting stored, and the whole idea is to collate all this sort of data into a common platform in such a way that one can literally create a digital twin of the patient, in which what drugs the patient is taking, how they are performing in real world, and this is something which can actually be used as a synthetic control arm in a future RCT that can be designed more meticulously. In very recently, in December 2021, the US FDA has released a draft industry guidance on the use of RWE and RWD. So, looking at the date, you can make out that it's quite interesting that so much new information and so much, I would say, consolidation has started happening when it comes to how to deal with real world evidence and real world data with respect to whether it's drugs or biologics. Now, just like we discussed few of the examples where the drug was withdrawn, these are some of the examples where actually the real world evidence was used for the drug approval as well. In year 2017, avelumab, on the basis of EHR data as a historical control for the efficacy, this particular regulatory action was taken, that the original marketing application approval happened. There are a couple of more examples, pembrolizumab, blinatumomab. So this is something, which is going to happen quite often, in time to come. It could be EHR data, it could be retrospective data from the clinical sites, it could be, a mix of EHR data, claims data, post-marketing safety. And that is something, which is going to be very exciting for the pharma companies, because the data is already there. And they just need to create they just need to analyze it as per a protocol, or what they feel might be happening in the real world. And then the whole analytics come into picture, and the data scientists, they analyze it and try to bring if a new indication could be approved for a particular drug. So this is going to be actually quite exciting because the data is already there, and that is something which is which makes it which is like a backbone of the whole concept, because now it's like there are hypotheses, and now those hypotheses can be tested by analyzing the data. So of course there is a complete cycle that how to curate the data, how to collect the data, in what format, and all those things are now have started getting realized, and different regulatory bodies have started putting forth their viewpoints that how we can deal with such a situation, how to standardize things so that we can bring the best value out of real world data, and how we can convert this real world data into an actual real world evidence to the actual regulatory approvals. Now talking about the biosimilars per se, now there has been quite a discussion that how the biosimilars are different from biologics. So just to recapitulate, like biologics, the manufacturing process is complex. So biosimilar cannot be an exact copy to the reference biologic, but certainly needs to demonstrate that it is highly similar. But one thing that we also discussed, and which is very important when it comes to healthcare, that biosimilars can actually reduce the cost of healthcare. And as Dr. Viraj mentioned, that the important thing is to have a better patient access. That's where the $1 billion earning comes into picture, when it goes to the $1 billion the billion patient. So that's where we are discussing about why biosimilars are so important. And talking about the biosimilars manufacturers and the commercial partners, they are certainly expected to increasingly depend upon real world evidence to demonstrate equivalency to providers and payers. And that's why this RWE is a buzzword these days. Now we have also discussed about biologic naive patients, where the biosimilar can be started without much of a concern, whereas the patients who are already receiving a previous biologic can be switched to a biosimilar only if it's associated with the if the profile is more or less same, if there are not much of immunogenicity concerns, or if it's as safe and efficacious as the biologic. So all these things can only be identified with the help of real world evidence studies. Like if you talk about actually the perception, in one of the surveys, the US rheumatologists, they were more likely to actually initiate a biosimilar to a biologic naive patient than to go for switching, because they were not confident that it's going to perform in a similar way as the biologic is as the biologic does. But I'll take you through the few of the slides, upcoming slides, where how this perception actually got changed. So needless to mention that when we talk about all these kind of studies, especially the switching studies, they all are real world studies, because we have to evaluate patients in the real world. So why real world studies for biosimilars is important? First and foremost, to demonstrate that a biosimilar actually performs similarly in terms of both effectiveness and safety in routine clinical practice, as compared to the biologic. Then to demonstrate evidence in specific areas which cannot be properly addressed by the pre-marketing RCTs because of the limited sample size and a complete experimental setting. And then definitely to evaluate the interchangeability of the originators and biosimilars, and biosimilar to biosimilar, which we call it as switching. So all these issues cannot be completely addressed by the pre-marketing RCTs. That's for sure. That's final, because real world is certainly way more complex than an experimental setting. Then it might sound like a repetition, but real world studies have further benefits. We can certainly include the PRO element. We can evaluate the economic impact as well, and it can actually provide a lot more comprehensive information about the biosimilar usage in the real world. And last but not the least, the confidence. What the physician wants is a confidence while prescribing a biosimilar, and that can help in enhancing the patient confidence as well. So if we see the whole armamentarium of how the real world evidence studies can actually enable can enable generation of different positive aspects for each stakeholder. Like for clinicians, they are absolutely bothered about the safety and the effectiveness of the biosimilar. So that is something what they demand. So that is something that can be dealt with real world evidence studies. Talking about payers, certainly it's no more about being safe and efficacious, but it also needs to be a cost saving proposition for them, because that's how the developed markets work. That's where the reimbursement of the biosimilars would happen, and that's how it's happening globally, be it US or Canada or UK. So definitely the cost effectiveness is something it's of paramount importance these days. So we cannot simply only talk about the safety and the efficacy aspect of it. And payers, they are the actual payers out there. OOP is less, OOP is more in India, but in the developed country, it's all about how the more power is in the hand of the payers. And coming to the patients, indeed, they want to get treated. They want that their health outcomes improve and they get better access to the medicines and easily. Last but not the least, FDA or other regulatory bodies, what they get additional safety and efficacy data. So the most important stakeholders in the healthcare are definitely banking on the real world evidence studies for all these specifications. Now there are some practical aspects of real world evidence studies for biosimilars. First of all, real world evidence studies are usually less resource intensive than RCTs, but there's a lot of data analysis that is required, and all these data sets or the sources that I explained in the previous slide becomes a part of, or could become a part of a real world evidence study. We cannot definitely ignore the registries. They are the powerhouse of real world evidence, and we do see the trend of registries happening in India as well, be it the disease specific or the product specific registries. But how to go about it? It's very important that the pharma companies, they choose the right real world evidence study design. That is something which is very critical, and it depends on multiple factors. They have to definitely identify and prioritize the evidence gaps. They have to somewhere determine the most crucial issue which is happening, be it on the efficacy, safety, or the immunogenicity, what they are actually trying to evaluate or extrapolate, whether they want to focus more on the switching side of it. And certainly, when it comes to the target population, that's again one of the factors that drives the real world evidence study design. How is the market responding? How much the product maturity is happening, and what exactly is the competitive landscape, etc. Now, real world evidence studies, these are few of the examples of the study designs. You can even see the screenshot of the study designs. So it could be either prospective observational study. These are absolutely non-interventional study designs, and it could be a retrospective study, and they both have their own characteristics. When we talk about the prospective observational studies, they can answer the key efficacy and the safety questions. They can help build confidence in a newly launched biosimilar. Indeed, they are more lengthier and they are more resource intensive, being prospective in nature. On the other hand, when we talk about retrospective studies, one can pick up a very specific patient population and analyze the data accordingly. One can actually answer the targeted questions as per the product specifications. Certainly it also requires large amount of RWD, and it is these days the way interoperability and all those things are getting taken care of, and there's a lot of discussion going on. So a lot of AI algorithms and manual curation of data, so it is somewhere possible to collate RWD from different sources now. So a lot of a lot of companies and startups are coming into this space, and it's all about, the data, and data is the new oil. This is like something which is happening, or being discussed upon, quite common. So one of the case studies, which I have put across is of epoetin alpha, which is it's EMA approved the first epoetin alpha biosimilar in 2007. And with the availability of biologic ARP and the multiple biosimilars for epoetin alpha, more data was required about the interchangeability and the effects of switching. And then, in Italy, a real world evidence study was conducted. It was a retrospective study design spanning across 6 years. And they analyzed the data of close to 14,000 users who were on epoetin alpha for anemia due to the chronic kidney disease. And eventually, the results were astounding. They could actually see no differences, between switchers and the non-switchers of epoetin alpha. So when it comes to the effectiveness and the safety profile, it was almost similar. This is where, while I was actually going through the different publications, this was something which was very exciting to figure out how there was a shift in the opinion, solely based on the cumulative real world evidence. So the echo position in 2013 as compared to 2017 was absolutely different. I mean, ad verbatim, if I actually say what they mentioned, the switching from an established biologic to a biosimilar to save costs is likely to be as inappropriate and ineffective as switching between the current biologics that act on the same target. But the same echo position, it dramatically got changed solely, with the based on the whole cumulative real world evidence that got collated around that time. And then they mentioned that an increasing number of publications have shown that there is no safety or efficacy concerns about switching. So this is the power of real world evidence. It can simply change the game. It can turn the tables. So I thought that this is something which I should be telling about in the presentation. But nevertheless, we are talking about real world evidence studies for biosimilars, but definitely there are a lot of challenges when it comes to real world data. First and foremost, as it's typically collected without a specific research question, that itself is a challenge. Second, the uniformities in the sources of real world data needs to be established. Now, this is something which is a lot of discussion is going on, and it's not easy to establish because of this interoperability concerns between different sources of RWD. So the lot of tech part is coming in. We are seeing pharma companies going digital, bringing AI, talking about data, talking about big data, and all this comes down to the actual drug approvals by the regulatory bodies. So this is how the dots are getting connected, because now there is an ample resources where the data is already there. Now we need to bring the technology, we need to bring machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms to collate the data, clean it in such a way we can bring valuable insights out of it. So the basic methodology of any real world study, standardizations is something which is very, very, very important. There has to be a step like data collection, there has to be a data cleaning, the data curation, the standard definitions to be used, how the missing data is going to be taken care of. So all these becomes the challenges, which are challenges, but not something that cannot be taken care of. On the other side, there are challenges at an organizational level or at a technological level or even a people-based level, because eventually, it's not only about AI and ML, there has to be a manual intervention. And I'll just take you through, like when it comes to the organizational challenge, talking about the data quality, the standardization of the data, governance, compliance, data privacy. So all, even the cost of data collection, although, real world evidence or real world evidence studies are indeed cost effective as compared to an RCT, but still, playing around with so much of data, and you still don't know how, how the findings are going to come once things are, or the evidence is actually out after analyzing. So, it has its own challenges, and we cannot ignore them. We definitely need to take care of data interoperability, and this is something, which is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the real world evidence studies. And indeed, we need to have a standardized research protocol that needs to be established, and that's why all these regulatory bodies are bringing different white papers, be it NICE or FDA or EMA. A lot of discussion is ongoing, and the whole idea is to how we can simplify the data collection, or how we can standardize it, the way we have a lot of standards when it comes to RCTs or medical devices. But when it comes to real world evidence, that is something which is going to get a lot more clarity in time to come. Now, talking about the concerns that I have already shared with real world evidence, like there are inconsistent formats, the sources, there are multiple sources. So the concept of real world evidence registry is something where there will be a lot of standardization that is happening in RWD for the actual healthcare decision making. Is something which is very, very important. So ISPOR, International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcome Research, so they have released this particular project in collaboration with International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, the Duke Margolis Center, and it has been launched very recently in October 26th. And the whole purpose is to prospectively register all the RWA study designs before starting the data collection, so that there is a lot more accuracy and the transparency in the study methods, like what sort of sources of data are being collected in what way. So it's there, as I mentioned, a lot of standardization is going to come now, a lot of clarity is going to come, a lot of protocols are going to set in place, that how the data should be collected, how the sources should be accessed. So this is where it might provide a reference to share with the involved stakeholders, so that they also know pre-hand that this is how the data would be collected, this is how the thing would be collected. And the companies would be required to meet the regulatory bodies beforehand, so that they don't land up wasting time and resources and money once the data gets analyzed and they might not get anything out of it. So that is something which is which has started happening. ISPOR has taken an initiative, and the different regulatory bodies also are coming up with their own standardization and protocols. So these are one of few of the examples. FDA has started making frameworks for real world evidence program. EMA or EU vision for use of real world evidence and EU medicines regulation. Even NICE has started to work to develop RWE standards. And so this is how things are going to happen in time to come. Perhaps the next 5 years would be way more exciting when it comes to the real world evidence. While actually we are making this presentation, we published this paper from an Indian perspective in 2016. So we were a bit shocked at our end that we could really see that this is something which is coming in a big way. We didn't know that much. So all in all, while I conclude my presentation, so the final conclusions, I would like to mention that real world evidence is generated from real world data. It has definitely a very crucial role to play in the evidence generation. By generating evidence from populations excluded by RCTs, RWE certainly complements the RCT findings. There are different sources of real world evidence, could be insurance claims, social media, patient registries, EHRs, EMRs. Real world evidence studies can definitely help in increasing the acceptability, access, and usage of biosimilars. And it will undoubtedly increase the confidence, among all the stakeholders that we discussed, in the previous slide. There are certainly some challenges, but those challenges can be addressed, and it's quite an exciting journey for the pharma companies to delve into the RWE studies and get benefit out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dan, for that wonderful session on real-world studies for biosimilars. So I understand that real world evidence is especially produced a lot of change in as far as safety aspects are concerned for drugs. Uh, what is the situation with respect to guidelines? Because most of the guidelines we see are based on RCT data. So how much have guidelines of different societies? How much are they willing to take up real world data to change their clinical practice? Considering most of those guidelines have been set on the basis of RCTs.
So as I mentioned that, most of these regulatory bodies are setting up the guidelines now. So, they are in the public domain, we can go and put our comments as well, but nothing has been finalized. Even the FDA framework, they are working on it. And so we need to see how exactly and what all guidelines they come up with. Of course, there will be a lot of overlapping between different regulatory bodies, what sort of guidelines they are coming up when it comes to not just collection but the impact of real world evidence. Because recently, if you notice that one of the drugs got approved of Novartis purely based on the patient chart abstraction study, and the US FDA approved that. So looks like that it's going to be quite an exciting journey where, only with respect or only with the help of real world evidence, be it an EHR, EMR, or patient chart study or a medical chart review, there is a potential to get a drug approval, and especially, makes all the way more relevance when it comes to the rare diseases, because that's where, rare disease data is mostly would be available in the real world data sources. So we need to see how exactly the different regulatory bodies come up with, but certainly we are seeing the approvals have already started happening.
And there is a comment from Dr. Vishnu. Expertise in which computer programming language would be desirable for collating and analyzing real world evidence from online databases, especially for persons with no prior experience in data or computer science.
Okay, so there is a lot of discussion is actually happening. See, mostly one needs to have a background of R, one needs to have a background of Python. SAS is something, of course, it's more on the regulation side of it. So, something might just come out of even that as well, that, because usually the industry standard starts happening. SPSS, pharma companies, they don't usually prefer. But there's a lot of discussion on the no code, this thing as well. And the way, the today's EHRs, EMRs are developing, there is a lot of inbuilt integration of AI ML algorithms already. So there are a lot of companies who already have these things in place, and they need not, and they are putting it across in such a way that not much of an expertise is required for analyzing the data. But the whole thing is that one has to go down to multiple sources. Definitely, it's more of a data science role. The engineers would be involved, but if somebody has a life science background, he will be definitely having an upper edge. But some sort of learning of these softwares and these algorithms, more or less, would be required if one wants to really get into the claims data analysis, or the EHR analysis, because it's not going to be a very simple a simple statistic. There have to be predictive modeling. There have to be a lot more other complicated, and healthcare analytics that needs to be taken care of. So yes, but with a life science background and having a degree in these softwares, or say not even a degree, I mean the knowledge per se is definitely going to help.
Yeah, I think with the advent of data science master's programs, I think we're going to see more of this in the near future.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Dang. Any
So it was
questions?
very interesting, Dr. Amit, real world evidence studies for biosimilars. It would be very useful for the young researchers, so they can do more research on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. The only concern, when it comes to India is nobody is willing to share the data, and even the quality of data is not that good. I mean, our doctors and physicians, they are overladen with so many patients to see that the data entry is not that much. It's quite good when it comes to the private hospitals, but it's not that good that one can actually do a proper real world study without any challenges. So but the way digitization is happening, the way government is taking so many new initiatives when it comes to the digitization of the healthcare data, in India specifically, 10 to 15 years down the line, there is lot that can be done with the data that is going to be collected in the next 10-15 years here, 10-15 years, or the data which has already started collecting now, because there are companies without any behavioral change, the prescription data is getting digitalized, most of the tests we are ordering online. But so there's a lot of movement. Actually, it's quite exciting. I would say, I mean, theoretically, how practically one would actually bring the evidence out of the real world data from India. I guess it would be interesting to see.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dan. Thank you for this wonderful session.